I'm with Climate Nexus, and because we're a bit of a new organization, I wanted to take a minute to talk a little bit about that. We're a nonprofit communication shop. We're based in New York. We've got a couple people in DC, and I'm in San Francisco. And we're dedicated to climate change. That's all we work on. And we're dedicated to creating public will for action on climate change in the United States. That's our bottom line. We work with a wide array of voices. We work with business CEOs, we work with farmers, we work with ranchers, we work with firefighters, we work with the religious leaders, we work with moms groups, and we work a lot with climate scientists. And what we do is we put those voices into the media. We put those voices onto the broadcast news, we put those voices in the New York Times, we put those voices onto Facebook. You may have seen our Facebook feed. It's called I Heart Climate Scientists. One thing you will not see in any of that is our voice. We probably have a story a week running in the mainstream news. Sometimes we have many stories a week, and never will you see a voice from Nexus. It's always the rancher, it's always the religious leader, it's always the climate scientist. And so, like I said, we're about developing public will in the United States for action on climate change. And so I want to talk a little bit about how we see as the roadmap to get there, because if you're going to use polling, and that's what I'm going to talk about today, I think you have to have a game plan for how you intend to use that information. So here's our theory of change. We don't think that you can just focus on one group in the Six Americas group, and you can focus on them with one message. So we think we have to mobilize the base in the United States, so that means we have to speak to them, we have to address them. You just can't ignore the choir. It's not going to work. You just can't focus on the middle. We need to educate the middle. And we need to neutralize the opposition, so we can't dismiss the opposition either. So we focus on reaching out to all those groups, but with different messages at different times and with different spokespeople. Yeah, it's kind of complicated. And so what I want to suggest today to you guys is that it'd be helpful for you to have a broader understanding of what's going on to bring the public along in the United States and figure out where you as climate scientists can fit into that choir. And to do that, I wanted to talk today about polling and where the polling trends are going in the United States and what that means for how to develop that conversation and how you can fit into it. So to start off with just a little bit of pedagogy on polling, there's two fundamentally different ways to use polling information. The first way is to use it as a roadmap. It tells you where you can go. It tells you what roads are available and what cities you can go to. And if there's not a road on that map, you can't go there. And the best example of this is a politician deciding whether or not to run for office. So about a year or 2 years out, they commission a poll, they look at the numbers, and they decide whether or not to run for office. You often see this actually in legislative battles as well. Should we run that legislation? Should we push that policy? How should we push that policy? And oftentimes this is where you hear people sort of push back and go, I don't want talking points defined by polling, because the polling is telling us where to go. I don't think this is the kind of way that we should be using polling information. I think we're in a different mode. And the mode that I think we're in is a weather report mode. We know where we're going. We know what policies we want generally. We want to limit carbon pollution. We want to switch over to clean energy. What we really want to know is, what's the weather like on the way there? How hard is it to get there? Where are the detours that we need to take? Or where do we need to beef up our vehicle? So what's the weather like? Let's dig into it a little bit. So the first thing I want to tell you is that support for action on climate change in the United States is a mile wide and it's an inch deep. The second thing I want to tell you, people get global warming, but they think it's a problem for the future. And I think this is actually a much bigger problem for us than the folks who deny global warming. I don't think that's a big problem. This, I think, is the big problem that we have in the United States. So here's some data. So there's many ways of asking the question about people's perception of the risk of climate change and whether it's happening. This is the way Pew does it. Is there solid evidence Earth is warming? And you'll see that there's been this really dramatic decrease and then a nice uptick over time to today. And similarly, if you ask people, is the warming mostly because of human activity? People agree. 69% in polling land is a really big number, so that's really nice. 42% not such a big number, but still it's encouraging. So you can see that a lot of people recognize the risk in the United States. If you ask people, you know, how big of an effort should the United States make to reduce global warming, 88% of people think we should make an effort. This is really nice, right? So now there's many ways you can ask these questions, and it's important that you have an understanding of that. If you ask people the question, do you believe in global warming? If that's your polling question, you're basically asking people, did you vote for that commie liberal Al Gore? So this is sort of sidestepping that kind of polarization, just asking people, how much effort should we make? 88% of people think we should make some effort. Okay, so that's the good news. This is the mile-wide part. Here's the inch-deep part. When you ask people, what's the most important priority for the Congress and the President this year? There's global warming, dead last. So people recognize global warming, they just don't think it's important. Here's another sort of digging a little deeper into that. This is a question asked by Krosnick out of Stanford. He asked people, what's the most important problem facing the country today? He had a whole list of things. The economy and unemployment came out top at 49%, global warming, only 1% of people said that. But then he asked the question a different way. He said, what's the most serious problem facing the world in the future? And then the numbers were reversed. I didn't list all the options on this thing, but I can tell you global warming was the #1 answer. So people get global warming. They just think it's something you can handle down the road. And why is that? Well, I think it goes a little bit into that lack of literacy that we're talking about. And I personally suspect that it's got to be that people's analog for global warming, the one thing they've got experience with, is smog. And it's coming out of the tailpipes of their car. But their experience with that is as soon as you clean up the car, the problem's gone. There's no lock-in. There's no accumulation. This is the only experience that people can bring to the problem that they've got some personal relationship with. There's another interesting thing about this, is that to the extent that people think that, you know, what's causing global warming, they think it's themselves. That's really how people think. They think it's coming out of their tailpipes, it's their car, to the extent that they understand the problem at all, yeah? So one, it's a problem that can be cleaned up as soon as you tackle it, and two, it's a problem that individuals bear the responsibility for. The other thing that's very clear from the polling data, like I just said, if there's a bad guy in the story, it's us. And this is very interesting because we went through a similar sort of evolution in the fight on tobacco. For many years, smokers were considered the problem. They were the focus in that battle, and we made no progress on controlling tobacco in the United States. When that campaign changed, when the tobacco companies became the problem, became the focus of communications, we had a sea change in politics on tobacco in this country. But we don't have that hot cognition moment right now in the United States. Hot cognition is actually a term that sociologists use, and what they found over the years is that when people have trouble in their lives, if it's bad traffic, if it's bad health, if it's bad weather, you just live with it. You don't get mad, you don't take action. But when people realize they're being screwed over, that's when political action happens in the United States. And we don't have that right now on global warming, and for my money, that's what makes the work that 350 is doing the most important work right now going on in the United States. Because by focusing on the fossil fuel companies through the divestment campaign, they're highlighting the bad guy. They're getting people pissed off, and they're giving them something to do to get mobilized, something we haven't seen before. We don't have a Tea Party movement on climate change in the United States. And why is that? Because we don't have a bad guy, and we're not giving people something to do, and 350 is doing that. So I'm going to walk back a second. I don't know if you remember this graph here earlier. So here's that downturn, here's that up bump on people recognizing the threat of global warming. So a couple things. One, look at Republicans. That's 35 to 48 in a few years. That is huge. You don't see that kind of change hardly ever in polling numbers. So something big happened in the last few years. Also, going back a little further, there was a dramatic decline. Now, some people point out ClimateGate is the reason for this decline. There's been published literature debunking that. That's not what's going on. The easiest way I can explain it to you is look at the decline. It started well before ClimateGate was going on. It was the recession. That's what caused it. And you might think, well, what's the recession got to do with climate change? People just don't have enough time to worry about more than one thing at a time. They're trying to get out the door, they're trying to pay the rent, they're trying to pay their mortgage, they're trying to get their kid to the babysitter. And so, there's only so much worry in Americans' minds. It may not be rational, but that's the way it works in our country. So, but what might have been responsible for the uptick? Because it's not like the economy came roaring back. So why did people all of a sudden start recognizing the threat of global warming? A lot of people say it's got to do with extreme weather. It's got to do with extreme weather happening. It's got to do with media coverage of extreme weather. And in particular, it's got to do with media connecting the dots between extreme weather and climate change. And there's actually been a pretty serious campaign by a lot of NGOs over the last 5 years, and particularly over the last 2 years, to connect the dots, working with many climate scientists, some of whom are in this room, putting their voices in the media to connect the dots between climate change events when they're happening and extreme weather events when they're happening and climate change. 4 out of 5 Americans now live in a disaster county, and I think this number is it's like a year old. I think it's even more now. So people are personally experiencing it. 82% of Americans report experiencing one or more extreme weather events themselves. As Max Boykoff talked about, you can see there was a large spike of media coverage of climate change around the first IPCC report in Copenhagen, but then there's been the second spike more recently, and it's been connected to extreme weather. We ourselves did an analysis. We compared the media coverage of heat waves in summer of 2011 versus the media coverage of heat waves in 2012, and looked at the total number of articles and the number of articles that talked about climate change when a heat wave was going on. And as you can see, not very many articles do, but there was a dramatic increase. Almost twice as many news articles and blogs were making the connection in 2012 as compared to 2011. So increasingly, the media has been connecting the dots. They didn't figure that out on their own. Like I said, there's been a concerted effort by many NGOs and climate scientists to help them do that. And I think it's critically important work, and it's responsible for that upturn in people's perception that climate change is real. And you see it in the polling. So here's, ooh, that was a little too fast. Asking people, do they agree? Is global warming affecting weather in the United States? 70% of people agree, yes it is. You can ask people about individual weather events. So the warm winters, the record high summer temperatures, the drought in Texas and Oklahoma, the record snowfall, the Mississippi River floods, Hurricane Irene, and large majorities of Americans agree that climate change made these problems worse. So it's not just climate change and extreme weather in general, but they are willing to talk about climate change in the context of individual weather events. Digging a little deeper, this is Boric and Rabe's work. So they asked people, what's the primary factor that caused you to believe temperatures are rising? So this is among the people who recognize that it's happening. They asked them why. It was an open-ended question, not prompted. And the number 1 response was observation of warmer temperatures. The number 2 response, weather changes. I do think it's worth pointing out that the number 3 response was melting glaciers and polar ice. So I do think that the melting Arctic is becoming iconic for people, and they just get it. If something as big as the North Pole is melting, there's something wrong with the planet. So even though it's a far away thing for most people, and generally we try not to talk about far away things in the United States, I think this is the exception. And it's been changing over time. So as you can see back in fall of 2008, these are the numbers for people citing it, and then by 2011, more and more people were citing the weather as the reason for their recognition of increased temperatures in the United States. There's a chicken and egg question here. Are extreme temperatures and extreme weather driving people's belief in global warming, or are people just justifying their belief in global warming by pointing to extreme weather that's happening? Been a lot of work by researchers done. It's not a chicken and egg issue. There's my timer. The extreme weather is driving the belief in global warming. This is Akerlof et al., and she's got a very academic way of putting it, but global warming appears to heighten people's perception of the risk through some combination of direct experience, right? Vicarious experience, i.e. those stories in the New York Times and the USA Today and stuff that they read on Facebook, and social construction. Cues, that's when leaders get up and affirm and validate the connection for people. We recently wrote a sort of guide for how do you connect the dots? How do you talk about climate change in the context of a particular heat wave? When an individual event is going on, how do you talk about climate change? It was called Connecting the Dots. It came out a couple years ago. We did another one called Right Here, Right Now. It came out in January, and it expanded the conversation beyond extreme weather to all kinds of right here, right now impacts. It's on our website. I encourage you to take a look at it. I worked with a lot of climate scientists to put the text together, so I think it's fairly robust. So I want to take a moment to talk about really quickly what's the advocacy community doing with all this information that I just gave you so that you can figure out how you could fit into that bigger narrative. So this is the messaging frame that the advocacy community is using given all the polling data I just showed you. Many different people doing different variations of this. This is just one, but I think it's increasingly becoming the dominant strategy. Pointing out current impacts. Extreme weather being just the easiest example, but not talking about climate change as something that's happening far off in the future, but as something that's happening right here, right now. Talking about that we can fix the problem. The most powerful messages in the polling about climate change have to do with solutions. By far and away, that's what motivates people. And finally, understanding that big oil is trying to block clean energy. Climate change is not a science problem. It's not a technical problem. It's a political problem. And it's really important to understand the nature of the problem if you're going to tackle it. I personally came to this understanding through talking to my kids. Well, not my kids because they don't listen to me, but my kids, the friends of my kids in the car when you're driving them and they're a captive audience. And so, I'd lectured to them about, global warming, and it was really easy to explain to them, well, why is global warming happening? I can just roll that off the tongue, no problem. Okay, oh, that's very clear to them. How do you fix it? Well, talk about and they're like going, okay, well, if that's what causes it and that's how you fix it, then what's the problem? That's a lot harder question to answer. And for me, that was a light bulb moment. Climate change is a political problem. It's going to take a political narrative and a political effort to fix it. So I want to talk about what you guys can do in this. So you've seen all this. You guys are so trusted. People believe you. Here's one. Here's another. This is from a battleground state in Ohio, right? So it's not like it's just crazies in San Francisco, New York, intellectuals who believe you. People believe you. But I want to point out something. I don't think that they want to hear a lot about the science. I don't think you can find a lot of data that Americans really care about science. In fact, I would suggest to you that there's tons of literature that we're a scientifically illiterate nation and we're not interested in talking about science. I'm sorry, it's just true. Well then, why are you getting all these calls from the media then? You're a climate scientist, they're calling you. It would seem to indicate that they want to talk to you about climate science and there's a hunger for the details. They want to talk to you because they trust you. That's why they want to talk to you. They just have some very fundamental questions. Is it happening? Are we causing it? And they want to go to someone they trust. So they're not coming to you because of your expertise, I hate to tell you. They're coming to you because they trust you. And so a couple things for me that come out of this. Tell us what you know. That's what we're hungry for, right? And a couple people put up their sort of bullet points. This is what I would suggest to you is what we want to know as non-scientists. We want to hear, is it happening right here, right now? And I think you can validate that, right? Are we causing it? Yes, you can validate that. We're causing it. We agree about this, right? That's something else you can tell them. I do want to take a side moment to say that I think we have a saying in my business, show, don't tell. So rather than telling people that there's a consensus, it'd be much better if you could show there's a consensus, right? And so rather than focusing on all the uncertainty, focusing on where you disagree with your colleagues, I would really encourage you to tell people what there's broad spread agreement about. And so sometimes you're going to get a call from a reporter and they're going to be asking you about this tornado right now. Well, you can back up the conversation. You don't have to jump right into a conversation about wind shear and convective heat and everything, You can take a moment and say, well, what do we know for sure? We know the planet is warming. We know we're causing it. We know we're already affecting extreme weather, right? And then you can sort of get into the particulars of the heat wave or the tornado or whatever, but start those conversations off with what you know. And then this is sort of another little segue here, but I think metaphors are now the flavor of the day. Everybody wants to use a metaphor. So I think the community is ready to take the next step, which is you got to use the right metaphor. And I'll give you a couple examples. I think the fingerprint is a great metaphor for attribution. Beautiful, perfect, works great. An example of a metaphor that doesn't work. I don't know if you guys remember that train on the track running down against the little girl as sort of the metaphor for global warming. Well, when does that little girl have to get off the track? Not till the train is right on top of her. That message doesn't convey the essence. Another bad metaphor from my perspective is the bathtub metaphor that everybody's trying to use to explain carbon sinks. Okay, yeah, that's a great metaphor. It explains sinks and explains input. But what do bathtubs do? They drain. And most experiences, they drain pretty fast. It just takes a couple hours. It doesn't convey the lock-in. That's the essential thing about the problem. So you need a metaphor that explains commitment, lock-in. Finally, the question I get in a lot of these things, because I work in politics, that's what I've been doing since 1985 when I first ran my political campaign. I've been doing nothing but running campaigns all my life. Is change possible? Well, what I want to point out to you, politics is non-linear. Change happens really fast. I don't know about you, but no one I knew thought we could have a black president. In fact, the people who I knew that worked on racial justice in the United States were the people who most of all thought it would be impossible to have a black president. So the very people who were working hardest to have a black president thought it could not happen, even 2 years before it happened. This is an obligatory Calvin and Hobbes cartoon, which I don't have time for because the guy's standing here. We'll pass it over, and thank you very much.